things. One, there is a sermon outline. You'll need to pull that out. And there is a green sheet. Green for St. Patty's Day, by the way. So you can pull that out as well and be ready with that, because that is our ending response time. So we've been journeying through this sermon series on restoration, turning our mess into his message. The whole idea of spiritual restoration, which is what Lent is all about, comes down to one question. That question shapes how we live for Christ and how we allow him to use us and how our mess is turned into his message. It's a question that we think is easy to answer. In fact, when we're asked it, it's like, no duh. Yeah, I know the answer to that. But it's really not that easy, because it requires us to go deep. It requires us to get off of level ground and to go a little bit deeper. It requires us to leave the comfort of our sin. It requires us to leave the comfort of this world. And to commit fully to Christ's kingdom. And frankly, it's a question that requires us to pick up our cross and carry it in this world, which can become rather frustrating. If restoration is going to happen in our lives, we must not only answer this question positively, but we must realize what the answer entails. That's the issue. The issue isn't answering the question correctly and then saying, I'm good. We just talked about this in Sunday school class. In Jude, verses 3 and 4, Jude says that he's ready to write to this church that he's writing to in a powerful way, but he has to deal with something. And what he has to deal with is a few men who have, he uses this words, wormed their way into the church and have convinced people to believe that salvation is just that. It's salvation. Once you have it, you have a license to do whatever you want to do. Who cares what you do once you have the gospel in your hearts? And Jude says, I got to call a time out here, folks. Because when that kind of teaching worms into the church, we now have a big, big issue. It's a hard issue. And so when we're answering this question, it's got to drive us to the thing that stands behind me, the cross. And what's the question? Here it is. Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? I mean, when you first hear that question, usually asked by, I don't know any doctor that would ask that question. Do you really want to get well? But you know the point. When the question is asked, the first answer that comes up is, well, of course, I don't want to be sick the rest of my life. But Jesus asked this question in a time, and we'll get to it in just a second, but he asks this question because he starts to see that certain folks, one in particular that he's going to deal with in John chapter 5. Well, they say they want to get well, but their actions say something different. Their commitment says something different. And so Jesus asks this question to this person, and if there's one person that doesn't have to ask the question, it's Jesus, right? Like, why does he have to ask me, do you want to get well, Brett? He already knows. But here's the reason that Jesus has to ask the question of, and he doesn't just ask the question of the man in John chapter 5, he's asking you. Every day. Lent is essentially, this is the ultimate question of Lent. Do you want to get well? Do you want to lay aside all the issues? Do you want to have restoration in your life? Because in order to do that, you've got to understand the entire cost of what that looks like. Do you want to get well? Jesus doesn't have to ask it, but he wants us to verbally say it. And so we ask this man sitting by a pool, and the exchange that we see here is absolutely life-changing. But there's more than meets the eye in many ways. And there are some powerful applications for us today. There are many applications that can be learned through this narrative in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. And so we're going to jump around a little bit in that scripture passage. But here's the first application. Jesus goes into the hurt and pain in our lives to provide restoration. He goes into the hurt and pain of our lives to provide restoration. Much like he didn't ignore the places riddled with sickness in his ministry here on earth, he's not scared of your issues. All right? Sometimes people believe, and I've heard this in my counseling sessions in my office, I've heard people literally, they don't say it in these words, but they actually believe that God would be shocked if he knew the actions that they have, or if he knew their heart at that moment. He does. And he isn't. Here's what it says in verse 3. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie. The blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One was there and had been invalid for 38 years. I want you to notice that Jesus has the right. I should deal with one issue because you're going to see this and you're going to ask this question in your head. Verse 4 is missing in some translations. The reason for it is because some translations took the route of adding verse 4 for more explanation, but it wasn't okayed to be in the scriptures. So some translations, King James Version, has verse 4. NIV skips from 3 to 5. So that's why, short reason, why you are seeing 3 and 5 up there, not 3, 4, and 5. So Jesus is not bothered by the brokenness. He's not somehow turned off by it. Notice what the passage says, and we miss it because we're just so used to Jesus doing it. He's walking through the land of sickness, right? It'd be like him walking through Faith Church if all those sick people were here today, right? He's walking through that, and he's walking through the land of sickness, and he has no worry. He's not staying in some 5-star hotel. He's not staying his distance from the lepers and from the broken and from those that are hurt. He's getting in there with broken people. And the point here is that he'll do the same in your heart. He's not afraid. He's willing to provide the healing that is needed, depending on the answer to the ultimate question of Lent, which again is, do you want to be well? Jesus knows there's something in this man's heart that needs worked on, and he knows the same about us. Jesus doesn't need to ask this question. Remember, he knows all. He's asking because of a lot of times, not so much in physical sickness, but in spiritual sickness, there's something much, much deeper that needs to be dealt with. Right? So when we come to restoration, Jesus knows the full picture. He doesn't know what you're just putting on, right? So when you come into my office and you say, here's where my spiritual sickness is, Pastor. Here's what I need help with. Here's what I need help with. I'm only seeing what's on your outside. I'm only hearing what you're talking to me about. When you go to Jesus, which is who you should go to for restoration, he sees it all. Now that should both encourage you and humble you. Because where you can fake me out, you can't fake him out. And where I can fake you out, I can't fake him out. He knows it. And so he comes upon this man and he asks this question, and then we'll get to the question in just a second here. But it's under the second point. Yeah, we'll fly there right now. I told you it's going to be shorter. The paralytic's poor views of God and theology leads to misunderstanding, frustration, and hopelessness. And I'll be honest, when I was sitting in my office preparing this message, as I had the commentary open, I thought to myself, boy, is that true of today for a lot of us. Here's how it works out in verse 6. Let me read that one more time. The paralytic's poor views of God and theology leads to misunderstanding, frustration, and hopelessness. Here's what it says in verse 6. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, remember we learned in the first verse, 38 years, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes ahead of me." Now, here's what I want you to understand about this question. This question isn't unique to this man in John chapter 5. In fact, in the 2 chapters prior to this John chapter 5 situation, Jesus could have asked this question to 2 other people. And maybe you know who I'm speaking of. In chapter 3, he could have asked Nicodemus, a teacher of the law, he could have turned to him very quickly and said, "Nicodemus, do you really want to get well?" Why would he ask him that question? Because Nicodemus comes to him at night. Why does he come to him at night? Many believe he comes to him at night because he's a teacher of the law. And he realizes that if the other teachers of the law see him talking to this Jesus fella who's a real pain in their side and who is really not teaching the same as what they're teaching, and they understand all of that, he's in trouble. And so Jesus could have simply looked at Nicodemus and said, "Do you really want to get well? Or do you want to continue to play these games where you meet me at night and you try to go around the back end?" Instead, just let's hit it. Then in chapter 4, he deals with a Samaritan woman at the well. You know that story very well, right? So she's at the well, and so that means since she's at the well at noon, she's not a very moral person, we'll put it that way. We find out later in the story that she has 5 gentlemen who are a part of her life who are not her husband. So she's that kind of person. And Jesus could have stopped the conversation at any point and said to the Samaritan woman, and in fact he does kind of with the living water illustration, he could have said, "Do you really want to be well? I mean, do you want to continue to find your satisfaction in these men or in my gospel? Do you want to be well?" So he could have easily used it in John chapter 3 and John chapter 4, the same question. It's a question that digs at something greater than physical healing. This man's view of God is that God has not allowed him to beat the others into the pool. It's a poor view of God. He says it, right? "Well, Jesus, yeah, I kind of want to be well, but every time this pool gets stirred up," because what's happening in the pool is that it gets stirred up and we're not 100% sure how it happens, and that's the uncertainty of why verse 4 is missing, because someone tried to explain why that might happen, and other scholars felt that wasn't a good explanation. And so here's what we know. We know that some people have found the pool stirred up every once in a while and they found healing. That's what we know. Do we know it's of God? Absolutely not. And number 2, you're going to learn this later, it's not always a permanent healing. They might have got out of the pool and then 2 hours later the ailment came back. So this is a permanent healing that's about to happen, but we'll talk about that later. But I kind of have to give you the backdrop of everything. And so the man's view is that, I got an issue with God because every time that pool gets stirred up, somebody jumps in before me, or I'm too slow, or whatever, and it's a God issue. And so basically what he's saying to Jesus here, and he's not understanding that Jesus is one who can heal him, so you got to give him a little bit of slack, but here's what he's saying, and it sounds a lot like what some of us might say. He says, God's the reason that I've been paralyzed for 38 years. So yeah, I want to be well, but you know what? God hasn't really helped me out. What would you like me to do, Jesus? I'm here. I'm trying. But I just can't get myself to this healing. The man obviously doesn't know of Jesus' healing powers, so instead of answering the question, he gives Jesus a gloomy testimony. I wonder if we don't do the same. When Jesus looks at us, look at the world, God. How in the world could you live it? How in the world could you work in my heart when the world's falling apart? Truth is no longer important. All these things are happening. How in the world could you possibly do? And so we give this gloomy testimony back. Yeah, do what you're going to do, whatever. Again, his poor understanding of how God works. And that's why where we stand on our foundation of theological beliefs is important. If we're wishy-washy and we believe this about God one day and this about God the next day, what ends up happening is we can fall into this man's trap. He has a bad view of God, and it's driving everything he says and does. You aren't going to get a positive testimony out of this man. Because to him, God has dropped the ball big time. An interesting point about the pool, and I just put it in there for just a point, and that is that one time there were those who we'll say were from the liberal persuasion with the scriptures that said that this pool never existed. So Jesus was essentially lying about this story. The problem is that an archaeological dig not too long ago found it. The Bible proves itself once again. It's there. Now, did this story actually happen? Again, we take the word at the word. But the point is that to say that the pool didn't exist is a lie. These supernatural healings, this notion of supernatural healings, we just don't understand enough about it to get into it this morning. That is, the first person in the pool, when it gets stirred, gets healed, actually took place. That has never been confirmed. So we don't know if this actually happened, but we assume because of the story that something was happening, and that's why all these people were laying around this pool. Jesus doesn't debate this man's theology and say, dude, you got this all wrong. Can you imagine Jesus saying that? Like, first of all, using the word dude. But anyway, dude, what are you thinking? But continues to deal with this man right where he's at, not where he needs to get to. So here's the good news for those of us who sit in this room that struggle with this very thing. Maybe God, quote, let you down, and you struggle with giving a testimony of God's faithfulness right now. Let me assure you that he is dealing with you right where you are. He knows where you need to get to, and he wants you to get there, but he's dealing with you right where you are. Jesus will do the same with you. Sometimes we think we need to have all of it together, all our ducks in a row. And for some of us, we don't even have ducks. We have squirrels, and they're at a party going nuts right now, right? Like, come on, let's be real with each other. That's part of the problem. We're not real. Like, we don't ever have ducks in a row. We have squirrels. And like one person put up on Facebook the other day, I have squirrels. I don't have ducks, and they're at a rave right now. They're at a party. They're going nuts. I don't know which way's up. Here's what I want you to hear from this story. And it's one that you have to pull out of the story. It's in the scriptures. Jesus isn't bothered by that. He doesn't say, look, get your act together and then come to me. He says, bring your squirrels, bring your ducks, bring your plans, and then we'll work on it. Because guess what? They're going to change. Some of us think that we got to get it all together before we can be honest with him and pull it together. And I've been there, done that. And it doesn't work because you're not ever going to have it all together where you're going to actually go to God himself and he's going to go, wow, your life is superb. You're never going to have it together like that. The important thing here isn't whether or not the healings actually took place in that pool. It's what the text is teaching that's important. Because of 38 years of being paralyzed, because of 38 years of paralyzed living, God had become a first come, first serve kind of God to him. He was ready to blame others. He really was. And before we jump all over this man, we can too fall into that trap, that very temptation. Maybe even not with physical healing. We can look and see and feel like the brother in Luke chapter 15, the one whose brother went out and spent all of his entire inheritance on wild living. And meanwhile, the other brother is standing back in the field, working his tail off for his father, working as hard as he can, and then he gets all upset and he stands out in the field and he pulls a hissy fit because, guess what? They're killing a calf for this guy who just blew his entire inheritance. Are you kidding me? I was the one baling the hay. I was the one fertilizing the fields. I was the one feeding the pigs and the cows while he was out wild living. But you see, despite how we trust Christ in many ways, and despite how we look at others in many ways, and despite how our attitude is, God is faithful. He's faithful. Look at verse 8. Despite the paralytic's attitude, Christ restores him. Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat, and he walked. Now it's easy to imagine that the man's first reaction was, "Jesus, did you not hear me? I'm a paralytic for 38 years. I'm not getting my mat and walking out of here. I can't do that. Why even try?" Yet something wonderful prompted the man to say, "If this man tells me to do it, I will try." You see, what Jesus was doing that day, and we miss it all the time, was he was guiding the man towards a response of faith. He was saying, you answer that you are well, you want to be well. I'm telling you, get up, take your mat, and go home. Now, here's the rub. When you come to Jesus for restoration, and he says, "Do you want to be well?" and then he asks you to walk out in faith, and you refuse to walk out of faith, don't be mistaken who's messing up the restoration. Don't for 1 minute think that that man couldn't have said, "You're nuts. Do you not hear me, Jesus? 38 years I've been paralyzed. And you're asking me just to pick up your mat and walk out of here. Do you not hear me, Jesus? For 50 years I've been in this sin. And you're just asking me to pick up the mat and walk out of the sin. Do you not hear me, Jesus? For 47 years I've dealt with this issue. And now you're asking me after 47 years to take a step of faith and to go out on that step of faith and to take my mat and go home. I'm not doing it. I'm comfortable here. See, at some point, Jesus is going to call you towards a response of faith. And the most important part is that Jesus restores this man in spite of his excuses and his attitude. In fact, we get a glimpse in verse 14 that the man doesn't even have it all together. He still continues to walk in anger and in frustration. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Maybe you've come here today thinking, I don't know. I'm not sure about this or that. I'm not sure what I believe, etc. I don't know. I know who I am today, and I'm not sure that God could do anything about it. It may surprise you to learn that He will do something about it, and He will ask you to step out in faith. Jesus will restore you right now, right here, even if your attitude and all your ducks aren't in line. But He might ask you to pick up your mat, whatever your mat is, your comfortable space. And He might ask you to believe that after 40-some years, you can actually change. And you can actually step out and get it right with Him. Because here's one of the last points. Sometimes restoration after restoration is needed. Wait, what are you talking about? For those that have had kids or grandkids, well, if you had kids, you're going to have grandkids, or you know what I mean. Anyway, if you've had kids involved in your life, let's get out of that jam real quickly. If you've had kids involved in your life, you've watched them, when we got Freddie, he was already walking, okay? So there was no problem with that. He was actually hiding behind a chair. This is the cutest story. When we first went to get him in Myerstown, PA at another person's home, he was hiding behind a chair, and the joke became the chair is a talking chair. And so every once in a while, you would hear Freddie squeak because he was going through that time. And it's like, hi, hi. And the chair would be talking to you. But Serenity, on the other hand, was still in a car carrier. In fact, we set off all the alarms at Reading Hospital because they forgot to take the alarm thing off of her car carrier. And there we are walking out as new parents. And all of a sudden, and the cops are running after us and all this stuff. But anyway, so there we are, and we're learning how Serenity walks. And so Serenity's learning how to walk, and every once in a while she would take 5 steps and she would fall over. Now, you've all been there. You've seen this. What kind of parent would say, are you an idiot, Serenity? Why are you falling? No, what do? You go to your child, and when she's about to fall, you either catch her before she falls the whole way down, or after she falls, you pick her up and you say, good job for the 5 steps that you did. Now, let's go for 10. And you continue to encourage that. You don't beat her up because she fell over after 5 steps. That's what we do in the church. Restoration happens, and we expect that people are just going to walk fine the rest of their lives. And then when they fall over, they're like, what are you, an idiot? Don't you know all you have in Jesus Christ? Don't you get it? And then we wonder why people aren't growing in the faith. Because what we do is we beat them up. They take 5 steps, they fall over, and then we yell at them and scream at them and say, come on, you're not as good as I am. I've been walking for 40 years and haven't fallen over yet. Oh, yes, you have. You just didn't notice it. And so, like the child who we're teaching to walk, sometimes restoration is needed after restoration. This isn't a one-time come to Jesus moment and you get restored and then you're perfect the rest of your life. There are times when you need restored, and we see this in verse 14. He said, later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, see, you are well again. Now, what literally that scripture passage means in the Greek is basically you are still well. And this is why they think some of the healings that happened in the pool were just a 2-hour healing. You get in, you have a bruised toe. You get out of the pool, your toe is not bruised. However, you come to see that person 2 hours later, their toe is bruised again. It was not a permanent fix. So Jesus is telling this man, see, you're still well, but stop sinning. Stop going back to the pre-restoration. Or what? Powerful words, we don't like to read them. Something worse may happen to you. Woo! Jesus blows his mind. He says, listen, I had you pick up the mat and walk out, but now there seems to be, according to people who are a lot smarter than me, there seems to be something still going on in his heart that he needs to deal with. And so he says, hey, he sees him in the temple and he goes, hey, dude. He says, hey, dude, I see you're still healed. That's great. But now you got to stop sinning. You got to live the sanctified life. And you got to do it. Why? Because something worse may happen to you if you don't. That see you are well again employs the perfect verb I'll give you the technical definition, the perfect of the verb, indicating that the cure was permanent. And again, that's important because some of them that were healed at that pool, by the pool, were not permanent healings. But Jesus doesn't deal with 2-hour healings. He's in it for your heart and your life. The man's 38 years of illness had apparently been brought on by some type of sin. It was a sin of the flesh, a vengeance in the flesh that had given him that miserable life. Now, do not go out of here and tell someone who has a disease or someone who is not doing the best. If you just believed a little more, you wouldn't have that disease. In my 19 years of ministry, or 20-some years of ministry, I've had to clean up that mess hundreds of times. Going in to visit congregation members who are bawling because some other congregation member decided to tell them that because they don't have good faith, they're sitting in the hospital room. Please, folks, please watch your words. In this man's situation and in some situations, sin is manifested in a physical issue, but not all situations. Paul refers to this in 1 Corinthians 11 when he talks about the abuse of the Lord's Supper. And he says these words in verses 29 through 30. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves. That is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep, i.e., dead. That's what falling asleep means in Scripture. The point of the text this morning is this. Jesus cares not only about your physical well-being, he cares about your soul. And he will be faithful to restore that soul. Tom Berlin says in his book, humility must be pursued. It's possibly the most important trait that Christ followers can cultivate in their lives. Humility takes the focus off of ourselves, and it helps us lay down our self-idolatry. Without humility, so much of our time is spent on the injustice or perceived injustice done to us. So if we want restoration, humility is where we must start. See, in other words, this man had to be humble enough to understand. It wasn't God that was holding him back. It was his own frustrations. And sometimes we can get so wrapped up in our perceived injustices that we focus on them instead of focusing on Christ. And listening to him say, would you pick up the mat and walk? Do you really want to be well? The green sheet in your bulletin says these words, Lord, I don't always have the right theology or the right attitude in experiencing restoration from you. Sometimes, like the man in John 5, I have excuses. Sometimes I get frustrated by my perception of your lack of movement in many ways. Would you help me this Lent to answer the ultimate question of Lent, honestly and openly? Understanding that even if I don't have the right words or explanation, you'll be nothing but kind. By nailing this to the cross this morning, I'm placing my restoration in your hands, trusting not in my response, but in your faithfulness to my response. Maybe you feel a little like Corey Asbury's song, Kind. I'm going to do something a little different this morning. I'm first going to read you some lyrics. Here's what it says. Sometimes rehab turns to relapse, and you're left just asking why. And for all the prayers I prayed, I still wonder if he's real. And if he is, how is he choosing who he does and doesn't heal? And I know I wasn't there, but when I look at the cross, I see the darkest day in history. I guess that's what kindness cost. I've tried to run from Jesus. I've started holy wars. I've tried the patient waiting and the kicking down the doors. I've cursed the name in anger and with my fist raised to the sky. And in return, all he's ever been is kind. Is kind. See, there was a behind-the-scenes thing going on in John chapter 5. There was a man that was mad at the very person that was sitting in front of him, standing in front of him. Maybe you come today, and while you wouldn't say that you raise your fist, he's asked you to restore something in your life, and you have given him a list of excuses. Or maybe he's asking you today to pick up that mat and walk. And what that means for you in your life, and I know this is hard. It means getting rid of 47 years of thought. 47 years of telling yourself this is the way it's going to be. It's the way it's always going to be. But oh, how beautiful the other side will be if you just pick up the mat and walk. So maybe you struggle with that this morning. And one last thought. He's whispering it to you today, that ultimate question. He's whispering it to us constantly. Every morning it's whispered to us. You want to be well? If you want to be well, then you need to humbly put me on the throne of your life. You need to allow me to work. And when I tell you to pick up the mat and walk, you need to pick up the mat and walk. And you know when Jesus does all of this, and I shouldn't even bring this up right now, but he does it on the Sabbath. And it drives all the law keepers crazy. Because Jesus does what Jesus does. And all the rule keepers look around and say, but that's not how that should have been handled. That's because you're not God, and he is. Would you respond this morning as we listen to Corey Asbury's song, Kind? Go ahead.